You're listening to The Secret to My Success, an interview-style podcast that asks our guests what trait, skill, or characteristic they possess that's made them a success. Hosted by Shelby Skurhawk.
So I would venture to guess in this gig economy of ours, the U economy, if you will, there are a lot of people that are looking to consulting jobs as a viable means of income for themselves.
Me.
Yeah.
Me.
So the challenge is, how do you learn how to do that? A lot of times, the consultants that come in, they're coming in with 20, 30, 40 years of experience. They've already kind of done the corporate role, have done every position within a company practically, and now they've got that wisdom of experience, of vast experience to be able to use as a consultant for other companies. But how do people that haven't had 30-year long corporate experiences, how do they enter into the consulting world? So that's something that our guest, Jeff Kavanaugh, explores in his new book, Consulting Essentials, The Art and Science of People, Facts, and Frameworks. So Jeff is a adjunct professor at my alma mater, UT Dallas, and he actually teaches a business course on consulting because the thing that he finds is that a lot of people have the technical know-how. They have the very best training and the very best use cases and all of kind of the B school basics, but there are still some nuances of consulting that people still lack. And one of them in the book he talks about is the sheer art of communication. So I will be completely transparent in saying I have never been more self-conscious during an interview than I had with Jeff. Jeff is the nicest person, but when we are talking about specific means of communication, and so in the chapter that we dive into, it's literally about the 6 channels that we use to communicate. They're verbal, vocalics, chromatics, kinesics, proxemics, and haptics. These are all very, very technical things that...
What are those?
I know, exactly. I was like, I didn't know there were that many. And so we go through them, and he's very well-read and knowledgeable about all of the nuances of these different things. So, for example, vocalics is... it says it's an important form of nonverbal communication. So it's basically people are assessing how well that you can hold their attention. It's the pitch of your voice, varying your voice, varying your tone of voice is important. So yeah, so it's all of these really small nuances that you don't realize that go into communication. But here's the thing, is that as he points out specific things like the way that you fill in spaces of time when you're thinking, whether or not you use that and which I'm very prone to do.
Everybody is.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's a natural tone of voice. And I actually read, I guess it was a kind of a clap back. Somebody had criticized a broadcaster. I think it was maybe even like an NPR person, saying that, oh my gosh, you sound so, uneducated when you're using this and this and kind of repeating your words as you fill in space. And this broadcaster makes the argument, you know what though? That's because I'm thinking. Everybody does that. And for somebody that has none of those spaces means that they're either speaking from a script or they're putting no original on the spot thought into what they're saying. And so that's a natural part of it. And I was like, yes, that's true.
I'd argue with that though, because the use of and like and are colloquialisms. Anyways, and see, I just said but you can be conscious of how you are speaking to the point where you don't say but you still have that moment of thought. So you take the pause and you are silent in the pause versus filling the void with like, And I only say this because I'm super conscious of it as a podcast editor.
Right.
I edit like 4 or 5 different podcasts, and I have to edit out so many ums and and it just kills
Yeah.
me. I just sit there and I go, "Man, guys,
Right.
just pause for a second." I'd rather cut out the pause cuz people tend to run their words
Mhm.
together, and again, from an editing perspective. But anyways, you're very conscious of
Yeah.
it. I bet you were even more conscious of it talking to this
Oh,
gentleman.
yes. I'm doing some I'm teaching myself to edit a little bit, and I've noticed that there is a certain shape of an in the wavelengths, I guess, if I don't even know if that's the right term, but yeah,
Yes,
like you can see
that's
it. You can see
correct.
an like it looks a certain way. It's like almost kind of like a diamond a little bit.
Yep.
And so I've started to notice those, but the thing I noticed in Jeff and I interview is that there was these long pauses. And so what I found and getting back to what I was saying about why I was so self-conscious is that he is very deliberate in his speech and his thought, and every single word that he says is communicated with thought without these filler spaces. So when I'm talking to him, even when he's describing the verbal tics that we tend to have, and he's like, so he's explaining it, and I'm thinking when I respond, okay, don't use it, don't say that same thing. And so there are a whole lot of long, quiet pauses in that interview, and it made me just so tense because I realized I was talking to somebody that knows language inside and out. I mean, it's literally like talking to a linguistics professor.
Yeah.
And so, but what he says is fascinating, and it does make you realize all the different things that go into communication. Certainly, as a consultant, but see, in the
See?
I guess in the what's the word I'm looking for? Gosh, words, they're hard. I guess in the application that we're talking about, it's just everyday communicating, whether it's public speaking, whether it's speaking just to a few people in a small crowd, whether it's one-on-one, um, speaking on a podcast. There are all these different types of verbal cues that we can use and verbal tools that we can use. So, you know, changing your tone of voice, having a tone that sounds authoritative, that even the way that you end your sentences, are you ending it on an uptick, like it's a question, or are you making a statement? And so all of those things, as we're talking about it, I'm like, oh gosh, I hope I'm not butchering this interview. But Jeff has some really fascinating insights for us, and see if you can tell how many of those pauses we've edited out of this next interview. Maybe you've heard this joke about consultants. Consultants take someone else's watch and tell them what time it is. And without understanding what they do, it can certainly seem like that's the case. Consultants can have a bit of a nebulous role, but what fascinates me about them is that it's their ability to assess a situation quickly, think very critically about solutions, and then communicate those back to the ones that hired him or her. As director of content at Success, I always wish that I had a better ability to convey and sell my ideas to the team and to the leadership with more confidence. I mean, the confidence of a high dollar consultant. And the problem was though is that I wasn't so arrogant to think that my idea was always the best, but I don't think I was confident enough to really fight for my ideas into fruition. So, here to talk about communicating like a great consultant is Jeff Kavanaugh, author of Consulting Essentials: The Art and Science of People, Facts, and Frameworks. He's an adjunct professor at my alma mater, University of Texas at Dallas, and a top consultant hired by companies worldwide. Jeff's secret to success is thinking critically, a skill that he says that we all can use daily practice in, and communicating deftly. And he's going to share secrets for effective communication with us today. Jeff, thanks so much for joining me.
Glad to have me, Shelby. Thanks.
So you say that these consulting essential skills really can help professionals of all types be better equipped to deal with what you call the quote post sale on demand attention economy. Will you explain that a little bit?
Would you repeat that question?
Sure. You say that these consulting essential skills can help professionals of all types be better equipped to deal with what you call the post sale on demand attention economy. What do you mean by that?
Sorry, that was a bit of a trick. I actually wanted you to restate it because I want to make the point that quite often we think we hear something, but even hearing it a second time, we understand it more.
Yeah.
It's almost like an advertisement where they say, I guess in the old days, it took at least 3 impressions before you would either make an impact. Might notice it and then get your attention. And then then later you might actually change your point of view or actually pay attention. And
Right.
I think that's one of the points I'm trying to make with this communication and thinking critically, is that with so much out there vying for your attention, it isn't even just your own daydreaming now. It's just everything coming at you. And the bad news, good news of these notifications that pop up everywhere so that you don't forget things. Well, all of a sudden you're flooded with those. And so just taking a little bit of time to think, as simple as that sounds, is so important. And part of thinking is listening, because it's an input to your thinking, and not just listening, but active listening. So I think both sides of communication, how a person communicates to others, either directly, like we're communicating now, or indirectly through the written word or something that's recorded, it is so important. And the reason I say that these skills are so important in this world is that we've now gone to where things are changing in a nonlinear fashion. The amount of emails, the amount of communications you get is exponentially more than several years ago, maybe even just a couple. The amount of things that are required of you are more. And these inboxes are no longer those paper inboxes of days gone by where you could see the 10, 20, 50, 100,000 pieces of paper stacked in front of you. Now they're just on a hard drive, or they're in a screen, or they're in the cloud. And so we don't have a sense of capacity on how much we can process with real work, or even just what we can process with amounts of communications, commitments we make, et cetera. So the ability to have a foundation where you can think, you can assess, you can communicate, and also you can convey to the other individual, or many individuals if you're doing a one-to-many, it's effective, because just communicating to communicate is almost like watching those talking heads on political shows. They're just there to get their word out. They don't even care if someone actually hears them quite right. And I think it's an important point when you communicate, how effective are you? And that's where I think having that foundation of critical thinking and giving some deliberate thought to your channels of communication and how it's being received are so important.
If communication is so vital to our existence and it's one of the very first things we learn to do, why do so many of us get it wrong?
First, I think it's hidden in plain sight. It's so obvious that people think they know it. Of course, I communicate. I talk every day. I kind of hear what you're saying. The other is that you may have something you want to do where you feel is important in isolation, but the moment you stack rank it against everything else, it just kind of falls to the bottom. I think effective communication is like that. Let's say you're designing a curriculum for yourself, for your teammates, or maybe if you were a school administrator. By the time you fill up everything you're supposed to put in there, the days, the hours in the day are complete, the days in the week, the months in the year, and there's no time. So you just let it fall off. And that's where I think, while the old liberal arts education had some flaws, one element of that type of education, or one noteworthy attribute, was it taught someone to think, took the time to communicate, took the time to deliberate, and that's something that's missing. I think in the pendulum, if a pendulum swings, it just often doesn't stop at the bottom. The momentum carries it through. And so in this effort, which is well intended, to become more technical with STEAM or STEM, the A, I guess, when you add to it for the arts, it means things are crowded out. if you add a course for coding, if you add a course for data, if you add more courses for technology, by definition, unless we found a way to increase the hours in the day, something else can't be added, whether it's physical activity or whether it's this critical thinking communications.
So the example that I used in the introduction about my experience with consultants, and I think many people's experience, is that they are so adept at communicating thoughts and ideas very effectively. But the premise of the book is to point out that that doesn't just come naturally. It's not just a gift for the charismatic. It's something that you have to learn, and before that, you even have to learn how to learn. So in the book, you break down the 6 elements of communication, kind of like a textbook would. So I want to study those and really dive into them. The first one being verbal communication, the actual words that we use to communicate. How much emphasis should we be worrying about the verbal aspect of our communication versus all of the other aspects that are there?
Ironically, because we're more in a digital age and because a lot of our communications occur through posts and instant messages and non-live situations, I think it's more important than ever. And also maybe it's because I work with a lot of folks for whom English is a second language. They're from India, they're from Eastern Europe, they're from other countries. And even things like idioms that we have, those aren't natural, or those might not be something that comes to mind for someone. One of my favorites is we talk about being between a rock and a hard place in a difficult situation. Mm-hmm. I had a friend, Luis from Puerto Rico. I remember years ago, he said, his in Puerto Rico, the way they described it was between a dog and a fire hydrant, which I actually think is a better view of
Right.
that. The other is a very interesting one. In the US, when we say we're going to table this issue, that means we're going to put it on the table off to the side and not deal with it yet. We'll deal with it later. My colleagues in some other countries, India, for example, to table means you put it in front of you on the table and address it now. It is diametrically opposite.
Yeah.
So let's not in this rush to talk about body language and facial expressions and everything else, ignore the fact that words are important, and also knowing, choosing deliberately what you want to convey. Simple words, verb object, for example, active tense, not lots of passive elements. Those are really important to establish, both just when you're dealing with people whose first language is English, also, of course, with others who it isn't. So I think that's the first element, is it is important to get words right and to know the definitions of the words you're dealing with. There was never an excuse, because dictionaries were always handy. And now there's even less of one for not knowing the definition of a word, because you were literally a search away from finding out what it means.
Right.
And how many times do you come across a word where you kind of know what it means, but not really? And 5 extra seconds, you get specific, and all of a sudden that entire sentence that either you communicated or you read takes on greater meaning. And then you say exactly what you mean, and you understand a little more what someone intends. And you also start to pick out the flaws in others when they communicate using words they clearly don't understand. Having said that, the other elements are very important because they carry a lot of what can't be said with words. How does someone feel? And also, because in this digital transformative world, this exponential world, we don't have as much time maybe to get to know someone and know what their words mean. We hang on to intonation, we hang on to the pitch, and we hang on to other nonverbal cues, maybe more so than we need to. In fact, in this discussion, I'm not face to face with you.
Right.
I've seen your face. I'm drawing a lot from the voice. Like, are you ready to speak or not? What's my next cue? And of course, what happens if we're on a conference call with multiple people and we're all in different rooms, all different locations. So I think it's not meant to be a conflicting answer. Just the verbal is more important than ever. because of the multiple languages and the importance of knowing what the words mean. And at the same time, because we don't always have all the channels available to us, and because we're dealing with such rapid fire communications coming at us, we will attribute or infer a lot from the nonverbal as well.
Is verbal still an accurate description for all of the other types of communication in terms of text and chat? And even I'm thinking of the phone-averse millennials that would rather, chat or text instead of getting on a phone call live with somebody else. Is that still verbal?
Oh, I think you have to say it's verbal. It's just the next evolution of verbal. It's an additional channel. We could have been talking about this several hundred years ago when this crazy guy named Gutenberg started to crank out these pieces of paper faster and faster. Was that a different channel than someone as a scribe in very eloquent graphic text? These monks, recreating copies of something. So this isn't the first time we've gone through evolutions. It's just happening very quickly
Right.
and informally. And the good news is the world is more literate than ever. In other words, they understand the written language. At the same time, the world is not more deliberative or contemplative than ever. So I think that, yes, it is verbal. At the same time, we need to understand that there's a lot of sloppiness because of the volume that's crept in. And there's a lack of respect, I think, for language as a tool, as a weapon, as a medicine, as it's so powerful what words and language can be. And I think it's too often just casually used and abused. And therefore, I think we have less of an opinion of it.
So the next form of communication is vocalics, and that's also known as paralanguage or nonverbal communication. So in the book, you talk about that this has to do with the pitch and the variations of your tone of voice. And those variations are all things that help an audience decide if they can trust you. So describe that trust factor that is inferred when somebody is listening to somebody and paying attention to these nonverbal cues.
I've learned so much about pitch through my daughter, who went to a vocal performance major at a leading musical university, if you want to call it that. And the layer upon layer, as the terms they even have to describe this, it's mind blowing. So part of it is, I call it the pitch. Do you end up or down? So, for example, I like you. I like you. I like you. Just simply changing that. And we can do this with many sentences. A lot of people shoot themselves in the foot or sabotage themselves simply by not ending firmly. Start firm, modulate, and end firm. It conveys confidence. And being crisp and with some level of energy in your voice also goes a long way. And of course, not going too fast, because if you're just rushing through, then again, through centuries or millennia of our minds being wired to listen to this, we take from that, well, maybe the person is either in a hurry, doesn't take me seriously as a listener, doesn't take the message seriously, or whatever it is. It's just not, we all know it's not quite right. And so it's important to have that cadence, called a warm blanket effect, where someone feels comfortable. And what happens when someone feels comfortable listening? They open up. They want to listen. And I think a lot of listening and communication is about not communicating well, like the presence of positives. It's the removal of negatives. If you remove distractions, if you remove biases, preconceived notions, then you can listen. And I think that's a very important overlooked aspect of interactions, communication, and excellence in anything, is don't forget to remove the bad things and the waste while we're adding the good things, because sometimes that can get you there pretty fast as well.
Going back to what you said at the very beginning in talking about vocalics, I think of the example of that up pitch, like you mentioned, ending a sentence in an up pitch, and especially the danger that presents when you do that in a board meeting, for example, or any type of business situation where you are trying to convey your idea and message with confidence. Back to that example I used, I would often end in that uptick as if I was looking for reassurance from the room instead of telling them, I was asking them. And that's what you mean, right?
Absolutely. And one of the reasons why I put the book out there, I wrote it and converted what I had been teaching and working with young professionals for a long time into this, is because I see the ability for people to double their advancement, maybe even triple their advancement as far as promotion or responsibility, if they simply do these things. Yes, you must have your content, and there are things you can do for that. If you communicate in a way that inspires trust and confidence from peers, from the first line of the people who look up to you as a leader, and others, it makes a difference. I tell the MBA class that I teach, here's how you communicate, both orally and written, so that your boss's boss's boss likes it. Or, this is, start thinking about, what does it really mean to get in the head of, or at least the trust of, someone in a senior executive capacity. They have so much coming at them. They're looking for a lot of these indirect cues to say, before I listen to you, how much can I really trust you before I have to verify everything? What kind of cues are you giving me? That's why sometimes the best written communication might be a footnote on a graph, because it indicates you did your homework, or an appendix that backs up what you're saying, or being very crisp and not say, well, I kind of did this thing. Say, when I did that 3 times in these 3 environments, this is what happened. Specificity is also a way to jumpstart or convey senior credibility. And many of the people I think that would be listening to your audience they'd like to be more credible in a senior environment. You mentioned secret to success. Part of it is getting taken seriously when you do get your chance to communicate something.
Right. The next element of communication is chronemics, and that has to do with the pace and the cadence of your voice. And in the book, you mentioned the example of a pregnant pause, which literally, if you consider what that is saying, it's the promising the birth of a valuable concept or idea. And of course, the example you use, furthermore, is that pauses can be used very strategically in speech, both in one-to-one speech or the role of a speaker to a larger audience. Tell me a little bit more about that.
A pause can happen like what just
Yep.
occurred. I took an extra couple seconds, and hopefully it conveyed that I was considering what you were saying pretty seriously. Actually was thinking about what you just said. And hopefully that reinforces to you that I care. And so I think these pauses happen before and then in the middle of what you're saying. I've done a fair amount of public speaking, whether it's in front of a small group or on a stage at a conference. And even a millisecond pause, we imagine in our mind, is this long pause and everyone thinks horrible thoughts about us. And it's not true. The mind calculates time a little differently, I think, than the audience. Point is, these pauses convey to the other that you're thinking, first of all, that there's a lot going, there's things going on. You're not simply reciting from memory. That there is an activity going on. This is not just a game. Use the right word. This is an activity. This is an interactive activity. We're not simply reading something, either from a mind or from a piece of paper. The other is we're trying to introduce variation. Let's face it, most of our communications, if they're done right, we're entertaining people at some level, because the opposite of entertainment is complete boredom, and no one will listen. Whether they should or shouldn't, that's a discussion for another day. No one listens unless they're drawn in. Vary your volume, vary your timing, and the extreme variance of timing is, of course, a pause. And then what it does, it's like asking a question, that Socratic Method, where you say, that makes sense, doesn't it? Or what do you think about this? Well, whether you want to or not, your mind is starting to work on the answer. You're thinking about it. It's not a trick. You're not playing a game. You're just drawing the other person in. It's also respect the other person to allow it to be interactive, not just a one-way discussion. So I think pauses, beyond all that, that's all great. The icing on the cake is it just conveys credibility because you're confident enough in your own skin and your own message to just stop. You're okay with a little bit of silence. You're okay with people being able to take their own opinion and think about what the situation is. And that confidence, I think, is so important whenever you've got discussions where decisions are made. And realistically, those are the most important meetings and communications we have, where we're asking for someone to do something we want them to, or there's a decision of some kind to be made. Do we approve the funding or not? Do we buy the company or not? Does the person get hired or not? Is this initiative funded or not? And there are other communications that are simply informational, but the more informational they are, the more they're suited for written communications anyway.
And actually, that pregnant pause that is a good tip for speakers in trying to convey importance, but also maybe pull attention back to the speaker. I know journalists use that very often because when you're asking someone a question and they are starting to answer, instead of diving into the very next question or rushing to fill in maybe what they're saying, waiting for that empty pause, I guess that's a technique because people hate those awkward pauses and they will rush to fill in more details and information just simply to avoid that discomfort. So it's interesting that sometimes you can think of that pause as a bad thing, like, oh gosh, what are they thinking? They're not saying anything, or used as an interrogation technique almost. But it does have very positive uses and being able to convey your message confidently.
And last point on that, the converse is true as well. When someone isn't confident enough to simply ask a question and let the person pause a second or two to answer, keep filling it in. Even this morning, I was had another discussion with someone, and I just waited until they were done. They'd ask a question and half answer it, and it took 30 seconds after they asked the question before they finally just stopped
Mhm.
talking. And then so that communicates something as well. And I lump, or some folks have lumped the vocalics and chronemics kind of together as this overall nonverbal. But I think by looking at these, and there are a few others as well that are lumped into body language, but I've split out a little more, I think it allows you to address them more specifically.
For reference, the next one is kinesics. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, kinesics. Um, yep, rather simple. Physical activity. It's adding something to the mix. I mean, now in business, it's a big deal to show prototypes and demonstrations and proofs of concept, and not just PowerPoint or discuss things. And this is one way of thinking about that. It's showing something. Maybe it's your hands moving. It's 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 showing something or doing something physical. Um, you could also say kinesics. You can put your hand on someone's shoulder. You could or shake their hand, or if you're in one-on-one discussion, and if you're in a broader discussion, intelligent use of your arms and your hands. It's really interesting to look at the Olympic athletes in this area. I say that tongue in cheek. It's really the broadcasters. When you see someone on television who's the top of their game, especially the network folks, they have done this for years. So they're arguably the best in the world at it. They use these gestures, but they don't overuse them. And a very simple thing now, especially with our smartphones, is video recorders. Just record. It's amazing to see what happens whenever you see yourself and the little mannerisms that pop up. There was a friend of mine, a colleague, his name is James. Years and years ago, we were first getting started, part of an executive development program, and it was being recorded. And we had to stand there and just give impromptu, I think, a minute or two on something. It was funny because he literally stood there, otherwise very, very good voice, deep, cadence was good. but he was nervous, and he literally would rock back and
yeah.
forth like a metronome, and you would see him leave the picture on the left, come back, leave it on the right, and after seeing himself, he was obviously embarrassed, and we all had a nice little laugh, and then he overcame it, but he just didn't know that, rocking on one foot to the other. And that's always stuck with me, that we all have these things, and being aware of them, it's not like it's a fault as much as, do you want to be effective as a communicator or distracting? And that's where I think kinesics can be positive, raise your hand and make that point, or it can be distractive by excessive movement that doesn't really support your message. And there's a word that's people like this Albert Morabian has used it, congruency. The different aspects of verbal, nonverbal, this body language, and kinesics, are they congruent? Does one part of your message or communication support the other? When they are, it strengthens them. When they're not, it's discordant. And I think that's something to look out for as well.
So if a speaker is speaking about if a speaker's speaking about confidence, yet they are looking down at their shoes and fidgeting, that represents an incongruence there in their message versus their body language, right?
Absolutely. And then what do you do as a listener? Well, one, you probably feel some sympathy or empathy, like you feel sorry for them. you want to help them. And the second is, you're not sure if, beyond receiving information, that you want to trust that individual enough to take a decision, especially a controversial one that might go against the grain.
Back to the book, the fifth element of communication is proxemics, and that stems from the word proximity. And this is another nonverbal channel. So this has more to do with attention to the use of space. Will you explain that a little bit?
Absolutely. If it's one-on-one, do I lean in, as I'm doing right now, but you can't quite tell because we're on a conference call or an audio, or do I lean back? If it's in a conference room environment, do I stand up? Do I walk towards a screen to point something out? Do I walk towards the person in authority? If I'm at a conference, do I stay behind a podium? Do I come out? Maybe even with these wireless microphones, do I walk out into the audience? So proximity is like kinesics, but again, it's use of space, and it's a very powerful supportive mechanism. It indicates confidence, first of all, that you aren't captive behind a podium or reading a script. Mm-hmm. It also means that you are coming to the audience. If nothing else, they need to be aware. I might be next. I might be the person that they come to or ask a question. And so it keeps people alert. It just keeps things fresh. So I think proxemics is about keeping things fresh and emphasizing a point without having to say a word. And so I think it's not the most important, but it certainly reinforces points and keeps things from falling into a rut, keeps them fresh.
Gosh, I know that dreaded feeling when in class, when the teacher, the professor is walking towards you and moving around the classroom. And I'm thinking, oh gosh, don't call on me. And you look down and you look away. That's probably a very powerful form of nonverbal communication to show them that I don't know what the answer is. And please go elsewhere.
Yeah. If you think about it, piling onto your point there, as a professor, that person probably doesn't want to call you out, doesn't want to get into some kind of embarrassing situation. At the same time, they want to make sure everyone's engaged. Right. And that is one way of doing it, is if you walk into a room knowing you might be called on and you're ready, well, then guess what? You're probably learning the material, you're probably prepared, and you're probably doing what deep down everybody wanted you to do anyway, which was gain the content. And so that's also, I think, a powerful use of this proxemics is making sure everyone is engaged.
And then the sixth element of communication is haptics, and that's the role of touch in communication. So this is one that I didn't quite understand, because it seems similar to the kinesics of putting a hand out when you're talking to somebody, conveying sincerity. But how are haptics different?
It is a bit of an overlap or a narrow distinction. In fact, sometimes in kinesics, like I just did, kind of lump them together. Haptics is meant the touch. And so shaking hands, presenting the business cards, for example, especially when folks from Japan, very formal way of doing that, could be hand on the shoulder. It could be, sharing papers. It just meant more of a connection, physical connection with others, whereas kinesics might be just be movement by yourself. It's a bit of a distinction, but yeah, that's the separation that I see.
And so being able to use all of these six elements of communication, and granted, it's not going to be very textbook like, where you're thinking, okay, first I'm speaking verbally. Now I will focus on my vocalics to make sure that my nonverbal communication is in line with my kinesics of what I'm doing with my hands and my body. Of course, it comes more naturally, but the point in studying all these is to understand all of these different subtle cues that we have in our communication arsenal, basically, this toolkit that we have. And all of those go back to the point of being able to convey your message, your idea with confidence and authority to be able to say what you're wanting to say, right?
It is, and the way I like to view it is between one person and another. Imagine a pipe. I call it the pipe of communication or comprehension, and that pipe, if you ignore all these communications channels, is extremely small. It's a straw, and so you could be brilliant. You could have the most eloquent words, moving prose, or persuasive facts and figures, and you're delivering them through a straw. Maybe it's like Morse code versus high-speed internet, and that's not good. At the same time, if you can somehow broaden that pipe of communication to where it's all coming, not trying to drown them, just what you're saying is coming through, because the mind can process, I don't know if it's 47 or 100, multiple times faster than someone can read, or if these distractions get in the way. So that's the real challenge. How do you remove distractions? And by being aware of these six, you can do that. The other is we have this secret weapon. We forget about it. It's our brain. It's not just the basics. It holds some facts, and we can call on those facts as needed and a few memories here and there. Literally, when we prepare and we're aware of some things, and then we get into a situation and we're focused on the audience or the message, these things are unleashed and they're brought together in just the right combination that we don't even think about consciously. And our mind allows that to happen, especially with practice. And that's something I believe, going back to the book, that turning that loose, unleashing that's where the exponential increases in productivity and fulfillment, I think, occur. And this is one element of that foundation.
As a footnote, in reading the book, you talk about the UCLA study by Dr. Albert Mehrabian. This study is often cited as saying that 55% of your communication is or well, actually more than that. Only 7% of your communication is conveyed through words. The rest is communicated nonverbally. But that's not exactly what this study was. Now, you mentioned it earlier in your answers, but I wanted to touch back on it because to talk about what it reveals about our strength in communication when we're trying to convey this message through words, tone, and body language.
Sure. Well, first of all, the study was done in the late 60s, 1967. I mean, first of all, he is one of the leaders in psychology and studying communication. So lots of papers, some books. He's recently passed away, I think a couple of years ago now. But so overall, great body of work. And he was studying individuals. And the reason, and he did find that 7% of liking was due to the verbal, and 38% to these vocal but not verbal, and then 55% he called facial, or like body language. The flaws, though, are one, this is for feelings and attitudes. It's about feelings and attitudes for someone, not total communication. So it's more of he was measuring feelings and attitudes more so than specific communication comprehension. Not that they're not correlated, but they might, but it's not exact. Second is that he studied only women and only non-working women. Basically people that could come and take his studies, I guess, during the middle of the day when they weren't working. So both when it was done, the people that came in their context, as well as what he was trying to measure, weren't the same. And so even, sound bites are not a recent phenomenon. People saw this and said, this sounds great. It confirms something that deep down a lot of us think, that words aren't the only aspect of communication. And there are some numbers or percentages around this, by gosh, and I'm going to go use it. And that just kind of spiraled, I think, from there. So it's directionally accurate, I strongly believe. It's just to say it's scientifically this percentage, and it's just not measuring, as we say in the farm, apples to apples.
Because the term you used, liking or percentage liking. So this is how, when somebody is speaking, they were measuring how well, I guess, how much I like the person, or how much I am convinced by the person of what they're saying and doing, not necessarily how well I'm comprehending what they're telling me or trying to convince me of. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. And here's a simple example. Let's go back to whether it's the last one, most recent, or if it's too painful, the one before that, presidential or elections. And you see people that are in these debates. If you just turn the sound off, and I think some people do, they still draw an impression of the candidate. Do I like the way they look? I don't mean, they're attractive or not. Just they look trustworthy. Look at their hands. So in some respects, people do this. Words or not, they'll look at a candidate and say, I don't trust her. I don't trust him. You can tell. And that's what this is. That's what I think this is really measuring, is your tendency to relate to and buy into a person's message based upon their words, or their pitch and their cadence, or their kinesics and proxemics and all that.
Well, Jeff, I really do appreciate your time. Before I let you go, though, I've got some rapid fire questions or some quick hits for you. So are you ready?
You bet.
All right. What is the movie that you can quote by heart?
Contact.
Really? Why is that?
It is a wonderful message. Carl Sagan was a wonderful thinker. We miss him dearly. And it's just it's a feel-good story. It's science and religion, and it's thinking about them in a way that's not confrontational. And really enjoyed the way Jodie Foster played her role.
Yeah. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Indirectly through Peter Drucker. He said the intellectual integrity was one of the best gifts you could have. The ability to see things as they are, not as you hope they are or fear they are, but as they really are. And once you have that, then you can see your situation and grow from it.
On the converse, what's the worst piece of advice you've ever received?
I think growing up on a farm, there were several pieces of well-intentioned, but maybe not completely informed advice on don't risk, don't do this, don't do that, and don't take risks. Make sure everything is very solid and very known, so that when you do something, you'll be sure to succeed. And I think I broke away from that and made lots of hopefully smaller mistakes along the way, and in some respects was practicing Agile a decade or two before it became into vogue.
Right.
And I think there was some cognitive or emotional dissonance early on because I was kind of fighting some of my heritage. And again, farmers are some of the most entrepreneurial risk takers on the planet. Maybe that's the reason why some of the advice I got was, don't do this, don't do that. Don't leave the Midwest. I grew up in Indiana on a farm. Don't do X, don't do Y. And I did them, and I thought, well, worst will happen is it wasn't the right thing and do something else. So I think it takes outgrowing sometimes, or trying to sort through where you're going to stake your claim, while at the same time not dismissing the well-earned and well-intentioned advice of others as you're growing up, because at some point you're responsible for yourself. And also at some point early on, you do need to take in this advice. And I think understanding when someone gives you a piece of advice, have they done that thing that they're talking about? Or when you ask an opinion, are they truly qualified to provide that input based upon their own experiences? And if not, then I think it's important to calibrate accordingly.
Right. And that's basically measuring the source from which the advice is coming from, and deciding whether or not they are a credible source for that advice or constructive criticism.
Mm-hmm.
So I absolutely agree. And finally, circling back to our theme of the secret to success, what would you say then, Jeff, is your secret to success?
Well, if we define success as the progressive realization of a worthy goal or ideal, and that you don't lose your head in the process, I think trying to treat everything in this, first of all, we should be grateful. Almost all of us have a wonderful situation compared to many in the world. The things we lose sleep over are not usually life and death. So I think an attitude of gratitude is important. I think also that treat everything in the context of service. So even when you're creating something, there is a customer. Could be a real customer that you're serving. Could be an internal colleague who's a customer, family member, the greater good, your community, your church. I think the moment you have service involved, then it's something beyond yourself. So you and others can get behind that. It's not self-oriented. So I think grateful service, and then have this intellectual curiosity and persistence is to keep learning and trying, and we're needed, apply it towards monetary gain. I think the combination of those things, intellectual curiosity and in this attitude of grateful service, I think has helped me keep a decent mindset. Very excited about the future and proud of what's gone on before.
Well, excellent food for thought. Thank you so much, Jeff, for joining me.
You bet. Thanks for having me.